In that regard, then it's really incumbent upon us to understand the nature of our perceptions. Where do we get the perceptions that run our biology? It's not so much the positive working perceptions that I'm really concerned about. What I'm really trying to bring our attention to are our misperceptions. And the reason for that is simply obvious. If we are misperceiving the environment, then by the nature of that definition, we are misrunning the nature of our biology. Meaning, if the wrong information is getting to the cells are engaging in behavior that is inappropriate. And it turns out this is the primary cause of the problems of humans on this planet. It is not their physiology, it is their perceptual vision of the planet that we live on. So in understanding the source of perception, let's consider 3 different sources that collectively contribute to the perceptions that run our lives. The 3 sources are as follows. One is instincts. Perceptional responses that we don't actually have to learn. Instincts are provided with the genetics of the machinery. We're born with instincts. Instincts are behaviors that are simple stimulus response mechanisms that require no thinking. So, for example, if I take a rubber mallet and hit your knee, your leg will kick. It had nothing to do with processing any information. It was simple reflex. The stimulus of the mallet engages the muscle of the leg without even bringing the brain into it. Instincts are essentially no-brainers. They can be carried out without any thoughts at all. If a child puts its hand into a fire, it will immediately pull its hand back out of the fire by instinct. Why? Because the muscles that will yank the hand out are directly connected to the pain receptors in the skin. It doesn't require conscious processing. So instincts are provided to humans through the genetics that we acquire at birth. And there's a large variety of instincts. Some of them are simple things, such as the reflex of hitting your knee and kicking your leg. But other instincts are very, very complex. For example, all mammals are born with the ability or instinct to know how to swim, a very complex behavior involving the swimming muscles and the breathing apparatus and the coordination thereof. That a baby can come out of the birth canal underwater and instantaneously swim like a porpoise or a dolphin, come up to the top of the water and take its first breath naturally by exposing its face to the air, then turning around and going back into the water again. All of this is an elaborate, extensive behavioral program that is provided by instincts. However, the vast majority of perceptions that run our lives did not come from instincts. They were acquired from our experiences on the planet. As we learn to experience things, especially things that repeat themselves, we start to recognize that our perceptions become automatic and more habitual. And the reason for this is that perceptions that are repeated over and over again are built into what is called the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is a database not just of the instincts that we talked about before, but of all of our habitual learned perceptions. These are things that are stored that require no conscious processing. For example, initially when you learned how to walk, it was actually more or less kind of a conscious effort. You were trying to stand up and identify, well, which muscles you contract and which muscles you relax to stay in balance. And to move, all of a sudden the momentum caused a different switching on and off of muscles to keep us in balance. The amount of muscles that have to be activated in just the walking process are so numerous that we can't even actually deal with them in our conscious mind. There's just too many different controls that have to be dealt with. But this is where the benefit of the subconscious mind comes from, because once the mechanisms were acquired, the subconscious mind stores the program for walking. Now think about it. You don't have to be conscious of walking. The subconscious are automated programs that require no conscious contribution, except for the fact of the intention. If I want to go from A to B, that's the intention, and walking, of course, is the mechanism. So as I go from A to B, I don't stop and then focus on, okay, move my right leg, now move my left leg, etc. I just have the intention. The subconscious mind is a very powerful information processor and can carry out that very complex behavior. But there's a very interesting aspect about the subconscious mind, and that is it works in tandem with the third source of our perceptions, which I'll get into, called the conscious mind. The conscious mind is the creative mind. The conscious mind is the volitional mind. It's the mind that's associated with our identity of self. It's the mind that is apparently associated with our spiritual identity as well. That this is a unique mind. This is a creative mind. It's live time. It can create anything brand new. This is very different than the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is not creative at all. Subconscious mind is the equivalent of a tape player. I record a program into the subconscious mind, and that program will play forever until I rewrite that program. The subconscious mind doesn't even have anybody in there. And this is very critical because the subconscious mind may have many, many behaviors that are actually damaging to us or destructive to us or even causing us pathologies. And there's nobody in that subconscious mind to say, oh, this behavior is good and this behavior is bad. Subconscious mind has no one. It's the equivalent, as I said, of a tape player. We recorded a behavior, and anytime the stimulus shows up that is associated with that behavior, we will immediately make a playback of exactly that behavior. And the relevance about that is then, more or less, this is a self-operating mechanism once we've programmed it. And then I go back to the conscious mind. I say, yeah, but that conscious mind, that's the beautiful part of humans. That's the part that is actually connected with the concept of free will. It's the conscious mind that has the ability at any one point to observe a programmed behavior playing from the subconscious mind and say, stop. I want to play something very different right now. The conscious mind is powerful in that regard. But then we've also overestimated the power of that conscious mind. As a physical process, let me compare the two minds so that we understand the power and where it lies in the subconscious-conscious mind subdivision. And it goes like this. The subconscious mind actually represents the operation of almost the entire brain, for the simple reason is this. Consciousness was an add-on in evolution. Before consciousness existed, the brain essentially was carrying out all the functions that we attribute to the subconscious. It was a reflexive behavior. Many organisms are totally reflexive because it's a stimulus-response mechanism dealt with by their brain, and they may not have conscious centers to consider why they're doing what they're doing or what they are actually doing. The subconscious mind is 1,000,000 times more powerful a processor of information than is the conscious mind, the little add-on piece that becomes what we call the forebrain. And so all of a sudden I say, well, okay, if I had to compete between the power of the two minds, right away I have to recognize this. The subconscious mind is 1,000,000 times more powerful than our conscious minds. And therefore, if I have programs in my conscious mind and programs in my subconscious mind, the tendency is the programs in the subconscious mind will overpower ultimately the programs of the conscious mind. And yet here's the interesting relationship that it requires very fundamental attention, and that is this. The two minds work in tandem. The conscious mind can actually control any function in the human body. We used to think the conscious mind could only control what are called voluntary functions, like moving your arms and legs, etc. But we now know, through the work of yogis, for example, that we can control everything, even things we thought involuntary, such as blood pressure, body temperature, heartbeat. All these other kinds of things can be controlled with the conscious mind. Conscious mind can control every aspect of our humanity. Except here's the problem. The conscious mind is a limited processor. Data-wise, it's been suggested that the subconscious mind can handle about 40 million bits of data per second, and yet the conscious mind in that same second can only handle about 40 bits of data. And that's why we see the 1,000,000 times more powerful character of the subconscious mind when comparing the two. So the interesting aspect about this is that the two minds work in tandem. The conscious mind can control everything, but the point is this. Whatever the conscious mind is not focusing on will be managed by the subconscious mind. Well, then this becomes an issue for if we are in our conscious mind and let's say we're involved with a discussion with somebody, then the behaviors that we're carrying out that we're not paying attention to are being run by the subconscious mind. Yet we don't actually observe those behaviors because the limited power of the conscious mind is focusing my attention on the conversation, and I don't even see the operation of the subconscious mind. This becomes problematic because most of us are totally oblivious to the action of the subconscious mind. And why this becomes problematic is if the subconscious mind contains perceptions or programs that do not support us, we may not even see that we are sabotaging ourselves. Let me give you a further example that may make this more palatable and easy to understand, and it will work like this. When you first got your driver's permit and you got into the car, you have no programs of how to drive a car in your subconscious mind. You haven't done it yet. So learning how to drive the car involves a conscious mind. So as you got into the car and you got the keys out and put in the ignition, you started to become very conscious of everything. The rearview mirror above your head, the side view mirrors on the doors. You started looking out the windows, the front, the back, the sides. You started looking at the gauges on the dashboard. You started to keep your attention on your feet on the pedals, the gas pedal, the clutch pedal, the brake pedal, etc. And all of a sudden you were also paying attention to the person who was sitting next to you yelling at you about your driving. And the reality, at some point, many people realize this conscious mind that processes 40 bits per second sometimes can't even handle that much information. Some people get behind the wheel and get frozen because their conscious mind can't handle all the information that's coming in at the same time. However, let's say now we've been driving for years. And so our subconscious mind has now acquired through repetition all the skills needed to learn how to drive. Well, the interesting thing is, now that you've been driving 10, 20 or so years, you get into the car, you get the key in the ignition, you're not even paying attention to that. You have someone, let's say, in the passenger seat, you're involved in a discussion. And as you're going toward your destination, you get so involved in your discussion that you as a driver at one point actually look out the window and realize you haven't paid attention to the road for the last 10 minutes. Well, don't be concerned by that because the subconscious is driving the car because your conscious mind was engaged in the discussion. And the conscious mind, not being as powerful as the subconscious mind, is actually even better that the subconscious mind is driving the car. It does a far better job of observing the world and handling the car than the conscious mind does. That's not the problem. The problem is this. You just drove for 10 minutes. And then I ask you, please describe your driving behavior during that 10-minute period. And then you look at me and say, but I didn't pay attention. I didn't see it. I was involved in a discussion. That's my point. My point is this. When the conscious mind is engaged, the subconscious mind carries out its programs, but the consciousness is generally oblivious of what those programs are. It doesn't see them because the consciousness is probably thinking of the future or thinking of the past or involved with some activity such as a conversation and not paying attention to the other behaviors that are manifesting at the same time. Most of us are totally aware that the jobs we do after they become repetitive don't require that much thinking anyway, because you can daydream while you're doing the job, and yet you're carrying out the job. And the issue, again, is you become oblivious to this. And one last point about the oblivious nature of the operation of the subconscious, just again to nail this home, because this becomes very critical in the rest of our discussion. And it goes like this. If you know someone and you know their parent, and you begin to realize that this person and their parent pretty much express the same behavior. And you have the audacity to actually suggest to this person, you know, you're just like your dad. Or you're talking to a woman, you say, you know, you're just like your mom. These people will almost look at you horrified that how could you have made such a conclusion? I am not my mom. I am not my dad. I don't behave anything like them. Aha. How come they didn't see the behavior that the outside person saw? And the answer was simply as we described before. Because in their conscious mind, they are indeed different than their parent. They are a different identity, a different spiritual connection. They have different beliefs and attitudes about life. Yet the reality is, the behavior they're playing in their subconscious mind is the same behavior that they acquired from their parents. As they're playing this behavior, they're not observing it. And that is the whole point of this discussion. That our conscious mind may have great intentions and our subconscious mind is usually running the show. And it does so with behaviors that are not necessarily the same as those provided by our conscious mind. And when we try to understand the nature of this, we say, well, where did we get these behaviors from, these perceptions, our ability to respond to life that we're not paying attention to? And it was already clear in my last example, from your parents. And why this becomes important, because now what we recognize is this, that yes, the nervous system already has incorporated instincts as perceptual responses built in when you're born. But once the brain begins to develop, it starts to read the environment, interpret the environment, and make responses. And so once you are beginning to develop and your brain gets past a certain stage of development, you are actually beginning to download perceptions, responses to the environment that adjust your behavior. But these perceptions are actually downloaded into the subconscious mind. And many of them, when we express them, we don't even observe them. So it's really interesting that we talked about these three sources of perceptions: instincts, subconscious learned experience, and conscious creations. And the reason why these become important is instincts represent nature, as I mentioned. They came with us with our genes. Subconscious learned experience represents nurture. Nurture means perceptions acquired from our life experiences. And so the subconscious mind has two sets of programs, the ones from nature and the ones from nurture. And it's interesting because over the centuries, scientists have argued back and forth, which is more powerful, nature, nurture, nurture, nature, etc. And in fact, in the last number of years, as the gene theory has overwhelmed us, we've really given up nurture and deferred to nature, saying that we're controlled by our genes and our biochemistry, and that nurture has very little to offer in this regard. And it's interesting because while people are arguing nature and nurture, everyone really left out of the argument the third source of perceptions, consciousness. And why this is important is because in the argument of which is more powerful, nature and nurture, consciousness makes that a moot issue. The reason? Consciousness is more powerful than either nature or nurture for this reason. Let's say I acquired some behaviors in my nurture experiences that are not really good for me. With consciousness, I can override nurture. We also now recognize that since genes are controlled by epigenetic mechanisms, which are mediated by perception, then through my conscious perceptual experiences, I can even rewrite my genes. So it's interesting because the argument of nurture and nature gives way to the reality of the dominance of consciousness. And yet, as I mentioned, consciousness is an add-on option in our human evolution. And in fact, most people don't even exercise that particular option. They live their lives mostly through the programs of repetition. They do the same thing every day, repeating it day by day, and their head is usually lost in the fog, dreaming of the future, thinking of the past. And yet the reality is, if your conscious mind is not in the present moment, but then according to the relationship of conscious and subconscious, the tandem relationship, if the conscious mind's not paying attention, then everything is run by the subconscious mind. Yeah, but as I said, when did we start getting these perceptions that constitute our subconscious experiences? And the answer is, we started in utero. That as we were developing as a group of cells forming the fetus started responding to environmental information as any living organism does. Every cell responds to the environment. Every community of cells responds to the environment. So the fetus is responding to the environment. But then you might ask, well, what environment does the fetus respond to? Of course, the mother's environment, because it's in utero. It's encased in a placenta inside the mother. And so the fetus doesn't have a direct access to the external world, the environment of the outside, to know what's going on. And yet nature deemed the environment very relevant in controlling genes and behavior. So in that regard, it's very interesting that nature provides information of that environment to the developing fetus for a simple reason. The fetus, having information of the environment that the mother experiences, can adjust its biology, its behavior, and its genes to fit the environment that the mother experiences. And the reason why this is necessary is because when that baby is born, it's going to live in the same environment that the mother experiences. So in the process, the baby is picking up information about the environment via the mother. Now, how this occurs is the placenta. Well, conventional OBGYNs consider the role of the mother in the development of the child as nothing more than the person who nourishes the fetus, and that's why they really restrict their information about a mother's contribution to her developing child to questions of, well, are you eating well? Are you taking vitamins and minerals? Are you exercising? All these questions are really just asking, are you providing the proper nutrition to this fetus? And the reason why the questions are so limited to the nutrition is that the conventional belief of modern science is genetic determinism, as I mentioned before. And since the fetus is a conceptus comprised of the genes of the mother and the father, we all have felt that the genes control development. And as a result, the role of the mother is really nothing more than to provide the nutrition. All the rest of it would be genetically determined. But as we're beginning to find out, that belief system is totally flawed. That the genes, in fact, are really responsive to the environmental situations. That now, then we understand that, then we go back to the mother's situation and we say, is the mother just providing nutrition? Well, that question could be easily answered by asking this question. Is nutrition the only thing that's carried in the mother's blood? And the answer, of course, is no. In the mother's blood are chemicals that relate to emotion. In the mother's blood are molecules that relate to control and regulation, the hormones. And why is this relevant? Because at the placenta, yes, nutrition is passed from the mother's blood to the fetus, but we also now recognize at the same time so is information. The chemicals of emotion are passed, the hormones regulating physiology are passed through the placenta and affect the child as well. And it's interesting because they have the same targets in the fetus as these chemicals have in the mother. So if the mother is feeling anger, the emotional chemistry of anger crosses the placenta, so does the child feel anger. If the mother is feeling apprehensive, the child is feeling apprehensive. And all of a sudden we start to find there's a direct connection between the mother's experiences or perceptions of her world and the experiences and perceptions that are downloaded into the fetus. Again, this becomes very important in changing the status of the fetus, this pre-knowledge of the world before the fetus enters the real world. I refer to this as the mother, in this case, as being nature's Head Start program because it's giving information about the environment to the fetus. The mother is not alone in this process by any means. The father forms a dynamic duo because it is actually the relationship between the mother and the father. That information is really what's shared with the fetus. So if the father messes up, that changes the mother's perceptions and her emotions and attitudes, which then impacts the child. So we should be very aware of this, that we started to get a lot of information about the environment even before we were born. Many of us started to get downloads of information that we weren't even wanted, for example. If the child was derived from a pregnancy that was not expected or planned, and the parents feel, oh my goodness, how can we support this child? Already the child, through the emotions of the mother and the chemistry of her physiology, is already gathering that information as well. We are not born a blank slate. We are already born with programs established for us. That, for example, a father can talk through the abdominal wall of a mother carrying a fetus. And as the fetus starts to hear the father, if the father repeats this pattern, then when the baby is born and the father opens his mouth, as soon as the father said a word, the baby knows exactly which one the father is. It already downloaded that information. People even play music to a developing fetus and recognize that when the baby is born, it will respond to the specific music that was played at that time. So the interesting thing is this, that the mother's perception of the environment influences the development and behavior of the fetus even before it's born. In fact, it can profoundly change the physiological character of the fetus for this reason. Consider the possibility that the mother is under stress, and then realize that the stress hormones that are going through the mother's biology and affecting her physiology cross the placenta and have the same impact on the child. And when we take that into consideration, remember the fact that was also stated, that blood carries nourishment, that in the development of a fetus, the more blood a tissue gets, the more it will develop. It's directly proportional. So now let's take the scenario that a woman is carrying a child and she lives in a stressful environment. And what do we find? Well, number one, the stress hormones cause her visceral blood vessels to constrict and force the blood to the periphery. Number two, we find that the blood vessels in the forebrain of her central nervous system, these blood vessels constrict and push the blood to the hindbrain to activate reflex behavior. Now let's put ourselves in the place of a fetus inside of this woman. Crossing the placenta are the same stress hormones. And in this fetus now, the blood is also being directed to the same places as they were in the mother. So in the developing fetus, the blood is now preferentially running to the arms and legs. Yeah, but the more blood the arms and legs have, the bigger they get. So all of a sudden, this fetus starts to get a larger physical body. In addition, the blood flow in the brain is not equally distributed. The blood flow is restricted in the forebrain and enhanced in the hindbrain, which means in this developing fetus, the hindbrain is getting bigger and bigger. But at what expense? The answer is the forebrain is not growing as well. And the difference between the two brains is hindbrain's reflective, forebrain is consciousness and executive logic. And what that really represents is, what is the consequence on this fetus whose mother is experiencing a stressful world? And the answer is, when this fetus is born, it's going to have an extra large body in regard to arms and legs. Its visceral organs are not going to be as fully developed as they should be. Its hindbrain is going to have tremendous reflex capabilities to operate that large body, but its forebrain is going to be significantly smaller. In fact, it is found that up to 52% of a child's intelligence based on the development of its forebrain is a variable based on the conditions that occur in prenatal developmental periods. And so all of a sudden you start to see that the mother's attitudes can profoundly change the physiology and biology of her child, as well as any pattern that is repeated will be learned by the system. So as the baby is born, it's already templated with emotions and physical characters derived from the mother's response to the environment. This is a very key, important fact, for it says this: parents act as genetic engineers. The child is not determined by the genes it's received. It is greatly influenced by the environment in which it develops, because perception applies to the fetus as much as it applies to the mother. So all of a sudden we start to recognize that we start getting perceptions even before we're born, that even some of our behavior is profoundly affected by this. It's now even recognized that even the stresses of the birthing process are downloaded into the subconscious memory, and that throughout life, patterns of the stressful birthing process can repeat themselves in the adult life, interfering with our lives 40 years down the road. So all of a sudden we now recognize this: the fetus is in a continuous state of learning from midway through pregnancy and onwards. We used to think that the fetal brain really wasn't downloading any information until just near birth, and then there was a tremendous spurt of activity and the brain starts to develop from birth on. We now know that this is totally incorrect. We now recognize that midway through pregnancy on, the nervous system is actually beginning to download perceptions of the world that we live in. And then once we're born, we start to acquire perceptions very, very rapidly. And that is because the fetal brain, when it matures into the baby's brain after birth, is designed to respond to the environment in a different way than our brains do. When you look at an adult brain and you look at the electrical activity of the brain, which is a reflection of brain function, we call this electrical activity an electroencephalograph when we record it. We can put wires on your head and read your brain activity. And what's interesting, in adult, we have the complete range of activity. We have high levels of activity and low levels of activity and everything in between. However, when we look at a baby that's just born, we realize it's not capable of expressing the whole range of EEG activities. That a baby starts out for the first 2 years in the lowest level of activity called delta, which in an adult is usually associated with unconsciousness or sleeping. Yet the fetus is not unconscious or sleeping. The fetus has not fully developed its nervous system, so its muscle coordination, its output parts aren't really integrated. So the first couple of years of its life, it's easily taking information in, but not able to respond. And as a result, the child is more or less like behind a plate glass window, observing the world and not able to respond to it while it's in delta. When a child reaches 2 until about the age of 6 or 7, the child's brain is predominantly in the next higher level of activity called theta. Theta is a state of imagination, state of creation, in fact. Very interestingly, when adults are in that stage of theta, when their brain is in that level, is usually referred to as twilight reverie. It is the activity of the brain just as we're beginning to wake up, coming out of sleep and before being fully awake, or the activity of the brain just as we're going asleep and we're not fully asleep. In these two states of twilight reverie, the individual can actually mix the real world with the dream world. So, for example, upon awakening, if you have a radio alarm clock and the radio turns on before you awake and you're in a dream, you can actually begin to mix the contents of the radio show with your dream and mix the real world with the imaginary dream world, and that's twilight reverie. Well, it's interesting because this is the predominant state of a child between 2 and 6 years of age. During this period of life, the child is mixing the real life world with the fantasy world. So when a child makes mud pies, it's not mud, it's actually a pie. When they're riding a broom and calling it a horse, to them, it actually is a horse. They're in that middle world of dream world and real world, and they live through that world through the first 6 years of life. By about 7, the child begins to ramp up and be in a more predominant state called alpha, which is a higher activity. Alpha is the EEG activity associated with calm consciousness, so that essentially consciousness becomes a character of the child's life after it's 6 years of age and onwards. And by 12, the child then ramps up to the even higher level of beta activity, which is focused schoolroom kind of consciousness. The relevance of all this is, for the first 6 years of a child's life, it is in predominantly delta and theta activity. These are very low levels of EEG activity. Interestingly, these are the activity levels associated with hypnosis. And it appears then that a child is in a hypnotic trance for the first 6 years of its life. And during that hypnotic trance, it doesn't have to be taught like schoolroom teaching. All the child has to do is observe and experience, and everything will be downloaded. The intelligence of the child is very, very active at this point. And in fact, a child, let's say at 3 years of age, can learn 3 languages simultaneously as discrete individual languages with their own vocabulary and grammar and syntax, etc. And yet when a child gets to be 8 or 9, it doesn't have that ability to do 3 languages at the same time. In fact, it's even hard to learn 1 new language at that point. What that really represents is that a child is in a state of superlearning for the first 6 years of its life, but it's not being conscious of yet. It's just downloading what it observes, what it hears, what it sees, what it smells. Its perceptions of the world are downloaded. If it's a male child, it will focus on its father and observe how its father responds to the stimuli of the world and how the father's behavior is programmed. As a male, it would look at the mother and see how a woman would relate to this father. And in the program, this young male will actually gather an idea of the kind of woman that he will actually look for when he's older. In contrast, if the child is female, she will really focus on the mother and see how she responds to stimuli, see how she responds to the father. The kids will see how parents talk to other kids and how they talk to adults is completely different. And that when an adult talks to a policeman, it's even different than when he talks to other adults. All of this occurring within the first 6 years, the child learns all the nuances of life. For me, it's always humorous when I reflect back on my own children. When the first time they used a swear word, which apparently I've been using, for me it was always funny for this reason. When they used a swear word, they didn't use it out of context. They used it in such perfect nuance that you knew exactly what they were talking about and what they exactly meant. So we learn more than just the word. We learn all about the word and even how to say words and how the nuances of words are very important. All of this before we're really even conscious. This is the programmable life of perceptions. This enables us to fit into society very, very quickly because we can download all the rules without even consciously thinking about them. We're just being hypnotized by the world that we live in. It's here where we acquire our perceptions of life. And it's here where we can also acquire our misperceptions of life. So, for example, if I'm in my backyard as an infant and I see my first snake, and I point to it, and my mother sees it, and she's with me, and she's deathly afraid of snakes. She sees the snake and yells, "Snake!" grabs me by the arm and yanks me out of the backyard to protect me. I've just acquired a perception, a download, a hypnosis. It says, this organism is called snake, and snake is dangerous. The significance of downloading this information is the next time I see a snake, I already have a subconscious program to deal with it. I see a snake, I yell snake and run like crazy to protect my life. Well, it's interesting because if I go back to that scenario and find that the snake slithered from my backyard into my neighbor's backyard, and in that backyard there's another young person with their mother. But their mother happens to be a herpetologist, let's say. And as this garden snake slithers into view, the mother says, "Oh, look at this. This is a garden snake," and then holds the snake for the child, and then hands the child the snake, and describes how beautiful and wonderful the snake is. This child has a perception of snake, but it is totally different in regard to the perception of snake that I received just moments ago. So when this child sees a snake in the future, rather than getting excited and running, this child will say, "Wow, that's real interesting. Let me be curious of the snake." So interesting point is, 2 children, same stimulus, totally different perceptions, meaning that in our later lives, we will respond very different to what we just learned. So what we're beginning to recognize is this. We acquire our ability to respond to the world that we live in, not from our own personal experiences, but by downloading the experiences of others around us that we might refer to as our teachers, that we buy their experiences, and those are the experiences of how to deal with life that are downloaded into our subconscious. And these are the ones that will operate from the big processor, the subconscious mind. Now, why this becomes important very simply is this. When I am operating my day-to-day life, I have always held the belief that I'm operating my life in harmony and agreement with the thoughts that penetrate my conscious thinking. And yet now we find something new. Neuroscientists are telling us of a surprising piece of data, and it goes like this, that anywhere from 95 and perhaps more closely 99% of the day, we operate from the subconscious mind, the more powerful mind of the two. And that 5% or less, probably just 1% of the day, we're actually controlling the lives with our own intentions and desires and beliefs that we actually entertain in our conscious mind. The significance is that when the conscious mind is busy thinking about things or engaged in some kind of activity such as a conversation, all the rest of the programming comes from the subconscious mind. Well, now we stand back and say, well, wait a minute. Most of the programming of the subconscious mind wasn't derived from us. It was patterned by other people that were around us when we were growing up. It's not even our own behavior. It may not even support what we would like to do. But do we even observe it when we express its behavior? And that's when I say, no, go back and remember this. The two minds work in tandem, and we're generally oblivious of the action of the subconscious mind. So this is why people, when they look at the world, get very frustrated and concerned, thinking, but this is what I want in my world. I want a wonderful relationship. I want to be healthy. I want to have excitement. I want to have joy. All the great things, these are things that I want. Well, let's look at it that this is a conscious intention and a conscious desire. But if this person comes from a dysfunctional family, then the reality is, while they're even thinking these thoughts of what they want, the subconscious mind is then carrying out the behavior. But the behavior it's carrying out is not the behavior associated with the conscious mind's intentions and wishes. It's a behavior that's just a replay of the teachers that they learn from, which may be totally self-sabotaging. And in fact, again, that's when you go back and you talk to that person and say, you're just like your parent. And to them, they're like, how could you even say that? And the reason, again, is they're fully oblivious of the programs in the subconscious. Well, what kind of programs that can we get in the subconscious that actually will interfere with us? And this is the interesting part because you're familiar with them already. You've already seen kids getting programmed with thoughts that are sabotaging and detrimental. I'll give you a couple examples. For example, let's say you're in a busy department store and the parents are pushing a shopping cart around and behind them is a little toddler who is grabbed onto some toy and now throwing a tantrum. Mommy, I want this toy, I want this toy. For a moment, stop and listen to what the parents say to this child. Especially if they're frustrated and they really want to get out of the store. They really make it short and sweet. Something like, you don't deserve that toy. Now come on, let's get up and we're leaving. And these kind of things are said to a child. You're not good enough for that. You don't deserve. Things that children hear when they're less than 6 are not thought about in their conscious mind. Their conscious mind's not even really working at that time. That's alpha consciousness. They're just directly downloading into the subconscious. What do they download? You were probably downloaded with the same thing. I was downloaded with things like this. Who do you think you are? You're not smart enough. You're not good at X, or you're not good at Y. You're a sickly child. You don't deserve things. Well, when we hear those and we're less than 6, remember this. We don't have to have an education. We just have an immediate download. The immediate download goes into the subconscious. The subconscious is a habit player. It will play that habit not just when we're kids. We'll play it until the day we die. So now look at yourself. Let's say you're 40 years old and you came from that particular family that was in the department store. And your conscious mind is now reviewing the current status of your life and not very satisfied with it, thinking, my goodness, I work so hard. I'm smarter than the rest of the other people on the job. I'm not getting paid as much as I should. I should even be the boss of my section. How come I'm not getting that? And of course, the immediate thought is, Because the universe and the conditions of the world aren't offering it. I'm a victim. Things are out of my control. I just don't get them for whatever number of reasons, and I can give you a whole list of reasons. And yet the truth is, they didn't get the position because that was a child that was repeatedly programmed to believe, you do not deserve things. And why is this relevant? Because 95 to 99% of the day, this processor, the subconscious mind, 1,000,000 times more powerful than the processor called the conscious mind, is playing the same program over and over again. You do not deserve, you do not deserve, habitually playing that program. And all of a sudden, that would cause us to engage in behaviors to make that belief coherent. In other words, I cannot engage in a behavior that will reward me, because if I get rewarded and I have a program saying I do not deserve, that's a conflict. It won't work. So what the subconscious mind will do will engage in programs and behaviors to be assuring of the fact that in the end, I won't get something because I don't deserve it. Now, why this becomes a problem is that there's a tendency to believe that there's actually something or someone in the subconscious mind. So that as we become aware of information, we think, now that I understand this about my life, I will be different. So, for example, people go to cognitive therapy and they say, let's review the history of your life, all your experiences. And they go back over every hurting thing that you've ever felt in your life. Every time you were rejected, every time you lost, you go over all those events and you relive them again. Interesting fact, you actually re-experience them. Your whole physiology re-experiences those original things. And now, all of a sudden, after so many years of cognitive therapy, you sit down and you're very proud and you say, I spent $60,000 and I know every event that caused my life to be the way it is. My parents did this, my girlfriend did that, my friends did this. I make a whole list of them. I'm totally aware of them. And guess what? My behavior is still the same as it was before. And what's the problem? And the problem is this. Somehow or other, we've held a belief that if my conscious mind becomes aware of something, that will automatically correct the data in my subconscious mind. But this is a failure. It's an error for the simple reason. The subconscious mind doesn't have anybody in it. It's a tape player. The idea of trying to change the tape player by talking to it can be expressed in a simple example. I give you a tape. You go home, put it in your tape player. You push the play button. You start to listen to the program and decide you don't like that program, so what do? You go up to the tape player and have a discussion with it. Say, this is really not a good program. I wish you would play something different. Maybe you could play something like this or something like that. And as you start talking and talking and talking, you realize I'm talking to this tape player for a long time, and guess what? It's still playing the same tape. And the reality, all of a sudden, you start to recognize is that it's not listening to you. So then you get mad. You get mad at yourself, and you start yelling at yourself, damn it, why can't you do things better? Because now you're talking to yourself to get the program to run better, and now you're arguing with yourself, and you're yelling at yourself, and you're berating yourself. And the reality is, who are you talking to? Not the subconscious mind. That might be your intention, but the unfortunate part is that subconscious mind's a tape player. Nobody's in there to even listen to your argument. The reality is, it falls on deaf ears. And after you get finished getting mad at yourself, then you're really left with the last thing, and then at that point, you really start asking God to come in and change the tape player. And the issue about that is, no, it will not happen that way. The tape player is a very important device. It was not our enemy. The tape player was actually an adjunct to our consciousness in this regard. Because if all the programs were run in there correctly, then I wouldn't have to pay attention to the things in my life like I don't now anyway, but the programs that are in there would actually lead me to a successful end. I mean, think about it this way. If you happen to be a child in a family, and this family was an aware family, a conscious family, a very loving family, a family that worked on a win-win basis, that understood balance and harmony in nature and lived their lives that way and treated each other with respect and love and everything that we would think is the most wonderful family relationship. If you were an infant born into that family, that would be the program in your subconscious mind. You know what's interesting about that? That individual can grow up and not pay attention to anything in the world. They can spend their entire life daydreaming, and that person will end up on the top of the pile. Why? because when they're not paying attention, every program in their subconscious mind would be leading them to very positive, satisfactory kinds of conclusions. But that, unfortunately, is a very rare exception. Almost all of us were brought up with dysfunctional relationships where our parents didn't have appropriate relationships. Their responses to the environment were not really fully supportive or encouraging of health or resolution, and that their information sent to us from them about who we are, whether we were smart or pretty or not smart or not pretty, and not able to do things, and not able to earn things, or not be worthy of things, and who do we think we are? These kind of the programs, when we get these programs in our subconscious, when we're not paying attention, those are the programs that are playing. So now we come to this very, very important conclusion, and it comes to this. We're not biological automatons controlled by genes where all of our programs are manifest at the moment of conception and the rest of our life is just playing out the programs of the genes. This is not true at all. That we are dynamic individuals, that we live in the world, and biological organisms are capable of adapting to almost any kind of environment. The reason why they're capable of adapting is they're not genetically programmed, that the programs of the genes can change and be modified by the experiences of the individual and the experiences offered by the environment. That through the perception of the living organism, the perception can adjust the biology. But while a single cell has very basic, simple perceptual abilities, a cell can see if calcium is there or histamine or estrogen, when we get to the level of a human, we have a brain filled with trillion cells that lies between the world that we see and experience and the internal world of our biology. The function of the brain is perception. It's to read the world and then adjust the biology. And why this becomes relevant is then we have a nervous system whose function is to learn the experiences of life, acquire perceptions, and then guide our biology and our health through the world as we grow and mature. And yet now we recognize that that nervous system has two parts, the subconscious and the conscious. We also recognize that the conscious is totally creative, yet the subconscious, the more powerful of the pair, is also the one that runs from 95 to 99% of the time. So our lives are actually the printout of the programs in our subconscious mind more than it is the printout of programs we would envision with our conscious mind. What's very interesting about that is, do we have to go back and find out who programmed what and where into us and relive all those experiences? And the answer is absolutely not. Because the message from all those messengers, the people who brought us the experiences are the messengers, the message is what's in the subconscious mind. While cognitive therapy has a tendency to go kill the messenger over the message, it's not relevant who the messengers were. It's not even relevant to go back and identify when and how they occurred. The simple reason is this: because whatever we learned is operating present time out of the subconscious mind right now, and that our lives reflect the program in the subconscious mind. Well, we used to think of our deficits and the wants and needs and desires as being something we weren't able to obtain because we were more or less victims of the world and we just couldn't get there. The new understanding of biology says if there was any victimization, it occurred within the subconscious mind. It was not the universe. The universe will offer you anything. So the interesting reality is, if you look at your life, you can already see the things you are missing generally reflect programs that won't allow you to get there, that your subconscious is already imbued with these programs of deficit. And so the interesting point is, okay, Bruce, you finally got me there. I got to see how I got programmed, and then I bought other people's beliefs, and that these other beliefs are running my life 95 to 99% of the time. But then you told me the program is a habit. It's a tape player, and talking to the tape player doesn't change it. Now the question very clearly is, what can I do in the circumstance when I realize that the programs that I'm employing are not providing the life that I would really like? How can I change the programs? And the interesting answer is there are many different ways to change the programs. But talking to your subconscious mind is not one of the ways because, as I said, no one is in there. So the interesting thing about talking to the subconscious mind is how can you get that information to be incorporated in the subconscious mind? What you actually have to do is a process that would be tantamount to pushing the record button on the tape player that's playing the tape. So as you push the record button, what you put in now is going to rewrite the program. Well, how can you re-record the program? At first, when I started to come upon this information, I actually had no idea how to record the program, and it used to be very upsetting because I'd close my lecture with this really wonderful mechanistic understanding that we are programmed devices and our lives reflect the programs. And then, of course, it was a big letdown for the audience because at the very end, the first question is, well, okay, tell me how to change the program. And I used to sort of back away saying, well, I can tell you about how the program works. I'm not familiar with it. So there was one point when I was giving lectures about how if you understand this new biology, you can create a life that's the equivalent of living in heaven on this planet right now, something I firmly believe. And when I was giving this, I'd also noticed that the people in the audience were a little bit unsure and skeptical about my advice that this could happen because they looked at me and they thought, for a guy who apparently knows all this stuff, your life doesn't look that great, Lipton. And that was when I started to realize that I would respond to them almost saying, and I'm glad I didn't say it, but essentially I said it was, well, do as I say, not as I do. Because I realized at some point is like, well, I'm talking about how you can have a great life, and my life wasn't that great. And then all of a sudden it really dawned on me, said, my goodness, I have conscious awareness of all the mechanisms, but my subconscious is completely programmed by other beliefs than the ones I just acquired. And so even though I acquired all this new awareness, I'm still operating from the habitual tapes from my childhood. So I started to try to pay attention to what can I do about that. And I started listening to the voices that run through our heads when we're doing things. So for example, when you're driving the car and let's say you come to the stoplight and you're waiting for the light, you can hear a dialogue going on in your head. Basically, it's tapes playing from the subconscious mind. And as psychologists tell us, about 70% or more of those tapes that are playing are negative and redundant. So when you get a moment, if you can hear some of those thoughts, just tune in every now and say, what am I thinking? Listen to them. Most of these kinds of thoughts are, oh, that will never work. Oh, that can't happen. Oh, I can't get that. These are almost all negating the things that we were looking for. And if you start to hear thoughts that are negating the direction you're going, then you'll have to recognize this, that powerful processor, that million times more powerful processor called the subconscious mind, operating 95 to 99% of the time with programs that say I won't get it, will actually end up providing me with things that I didn't want. Things that I couldn't get the things I wanted because my mind wouldn't even allow them to come in. So as I started to listen to these, I started to recognize that in the process, I could actually hear something like a negative thing like, oh, that's not going to happen. And then I would consciously say, no, wait, that's not true. It can happen. I can get this. And I started to realize that if you become conscious of these thoughts, you can actually interact with them as they're being manifest and change them live time. Well, what happens is if you continuously do this process through something equivalent to habituation, you can lead to a rewriting of these codes. Now, but there's a problem with that, and that is in the world that we live in, with so much activity and the speed of life that we go by, we really don't have at our fingertips the ease and comfort of sitting back to listen and communicate with our thoughts. So it's very hard to do this. This process I later found out was called Buddhist mindfulness, being mindful, being conscious all the time. And that alone is really where the power is for this simple reason. The conscious mind has all the wishes and aspirations and desires that you want for your life. If you stay conscious and stop daydreaming and stop thinking about the past and the future and be here now, then you are actually running the machine live with the intentions that you like. But the moment life starts to get busy and all of a sudden you start thinking about things and contemplating the past or the future, then you automatically start operating off of the mind that has the programs that do not support you. So Buddhist mindfulness is a way of getting there, but it's really difficult for most people to use that because of the time and the investment it takes to pay attention to your thoughts. So I later found there was another way that was very effective, and that would be clinical hypnosis. And the reason for why that is effective is simply is that is the same state in which the subconscious was programmed originally. We were below alpha wave activity. We were in more or less theta wave activity, and theta is the hypnagogic trance. So I can go back into a hypnotic trance through a clinical hypnotherapist who can help me slow down my conscious thoughts, allow me to get into the hypnagogic state, and then reprogram the beliefs that were loaded into my subconscious mind. That is a very effective way as well. And lastly, there is now a whole variety of modalities that are collectively referred to as energy psychology. And the significance of energy psychology is that it's not cognitive therapy at all. It actually just deals with the energy in the field. It involves characteristics associated with superlearning, the ability to open up the brain and download information at rates of speed that are just phenomenal. And the relevance about all that is that using these varieties of different modalities of energy psychology, many of them have letters like EFT, TFT, EMDR. Some of them are sort of body talk is one form, avatar is another, Psych-K is the one that I work with. These are a variety of modalities that allow us to impact the program in the subconscious using an energy process wherein we can change beliefs that have limited us our whole lives, 50, 60 years, change a belief in about 10 minutes or so and walk away a completely different person as a consequence of this. So basically what it really says is we start to get into a new understanding of who we really are. We are not the genes. We are not the physical body. We are the mind inside the system. The mind, via the perceptions, control every aspect of our biology, our behavior, and our genes. And that we must understand that if we experience problems in the world that we live in today, it's not because there's generally something wrong with us and our biology. It's almost inevitably associated with there's something wrong with our programming and our belief about who we are and why we are on this planet. Because if we begin to understand this nature, if we begin to understand that we can reprogram ourselves, we can free ourselves from the past, we can free ourselves from the limitation, we can change our health by changing our mind. I mean, the best example of something like that is consider the people who are laying on their deathbed, terminal cancer, everybody writing them off, thinking it's too late, they're gone. And all of a sudden this person gets up and says, I'm not buying this. I don't care about, if I only have a short time left, then I'm going out there and I'm going to live the life that I wanted to live, not the one that I was programmed to live. And it's interesting because these are the people, when they get up off of that deathbed and they actually change the style of their life, are the ones that express what is called a spontaneous remission. They change their perceptions change their biology. This is not an unusual thing. Many of you are actually very familiar with a pathology associated with that called multiple personalities. Interesting about multiple personalities, these are people that have a pathology in a sense where they actually switch from one personality into another personality. What's very interesting about this, while they are, of course, neurological switches that occur as they go from one personality to the other, almost every time, there are also physiological and physical characteristics that switch at the very same time. That in personality A, they could have brown eyes, and in personality B, they can have gray eyes, and this changes in about a minute or so. That in personality A, they can have an anaphylactic response, let's say, to dogs. And then a minute later, when they switch into personality B, they could play in a whole pile of dogs and never have a problem with it. But you switch them right back to A, and then one dog will cause an anaphylactic response. And so basically what we recognize as people change their personality, they also accommodate the changes by changing their physiology and their physical selves as well. Well, this is a pathology and not a lot of people are interested in that, but how about real life issues like, actors? Actors are interesting in this regard because when they take on a character, they also acquire the personality to play the character. And the better the actor they are, the more the personality takes over their lives. Some actors can gain 40 pounds for a role, and then as soon as the role is over, lose 40 pounds. Some actors could be thin and frail and then play somebody like Cassius Clay in a movie, and the next time you see them, you'll see him and say, oh my God, look at the physical build on this guy. And then the last movie I saw him in, he was a skinny little rail. And all this came about from what reason? The ability to take on the personality, change the personality in their life, and operate their body from a different personality led to a different biology. All of these examples are very clear and positive examples of how the mind controls biology. This includes what we call the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a person is sick and is given a pill wherein the doctor says, this is the newest, most effective pill for what you have. It's just out of the research labs. You're really going to love this pill. And the doctor gives them the pill and they get better, only later to find out that the pill was really nothing more than sugar or chalk, that there wasn't anything in there except for the belief. And it's interesting because it's now found that the minimum 35 to 40% of any drug's action is directly related to the placebo effect. And what to me is very interesting is while the drug companies actually want to eliminate the placebo effect, I'm still really questioning as to why aren't we enhancing the placebo effect? Why don't we leverage our perception to work with us and to heal us rather than trying to fake ourselves out? Change our belief systems is what it's all about. And interesting, while the placebo effect represents an example of a positive belief that leads to a positive conclusion, there's an also equally powerful but oppositely directed effect called the nocebo effect. The nocebo effect is when someone tells you something bad news or some limitation that all of a sudden becomes yours because they told you that. And when you start to recognize that as well, good news can heal you, bad news can make you sick. People can actually die just because of the belief of bad news. People can generate issues of physiology that are not really manifest for any other reason than their belief system because they expect to. And all of a sudden, we start to really dabble into what is powerful in the world that we live in. Is it the physical machine? Is it the biochemistry, the genes, as the medical profession would have us believe, especially as the drug company would have us believe, because they sell us drugs to fix up who we are? And yet the reality is the new biology says it's completely different than anything we ever thought before, because we are not a genetic automaton. We are a device controlled by perception, and we control perception. And by doing that, we can control the lives that we have. Today, we live in a world that is on the brink of destruction. There are crises in every area of the world that we look at. Healthcare, people, governments, the ecology, everything is in a strange upheaval. And it turns out the scientists have recognized that the extinction that we are facing on the world right now is not due to anything other but our human behavior. And basically it says for us to survive, we have to change our behavior. I personally am very familiar with this because having been there in the 1970s and starting to recognize that the conventional belief of genes controlling life was really wrong, that environment was important, I started to recognize that if I changed my perception of the environment, that I would change the life I lead. And it's interesting because I sit here today telling you this information only from the enthusiasm of a guy who has experienced it. My life was nothing that I would have loved to claim before, and yet today, at this very moment, I sit here talking to you, telling you, if there is a heaven, I firmly believe it is here on this planet right now, because the life that I'm leading with my new perceptions of the fact that the universe supports me and loves me, and I find that in the community of life, I now have a completely different life on this planet. I didn't take any drugs or chemicals for this. It was basically an understanding of changing our perceptions, our beliefs about life. It's belief that is powerful. I wasn't raised in the Christian tradition, and yet I refer back to the master teacher Jesus. And he was the man who said, you could renew your life with your beliefs. I fully see that now as a scientific fact. And it's important because he said you can do all of the miracles that he could do, even better than he can do, but he said you didn't believe. And that, again, is the truth. So what I leave you with is a little piece of advice, and you hope you will follow it, and that is, recognize this: the world fully supports who we are. If there are any problems, it's usually acquired from other people who had put us down and taken away power from us. That you are fully powerful to do all the miracles that Jesus talked about, but you have to believe so. To believe so, you have to find out what programs in your subconscious mind are not supporting you and begin to change those programs into programs that encourage your vitality, your health, your life, your prosperity, and your love on this beautiful planet called Earth. Thank you.
This concludes The Biology of Belief with Dr. Bruce Lipton. Music by Stephen McNamara. For more information on the work and public appearances by Dr. Bruce Lipton, please visit www.brucelipton.com. If you would like additional copies of this audio learning program, or to receive a free catalog of Wisdom for the Inner Life, please contact Sounds True, www.soundstrue.com. support.soundstrue.com or call us toll-free 1-800-333-9185 or write to us at Sounds True, P.O. Box 8010, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Thank you for listening.